My name is Jill Hoffman. I'm the Executive Director for the White River Alliance. Welcome to our PFAS Forum. Thank you so much for making time out of your day to come learn some things about our water quality and threats to it, and some things that are going on in other states. We have a lot to talk about. So we're glad you're here. We are going to make this as interactive as we can over a Zoom format, but that means we need you to make use of the chat rather than use your microphone. So please feel free to put any questions that you have throughout the day in the chat. We have two parts of our agenda open for questions, so we will make room for those. And if we don't get to something, we'll be sure to get you those answers and send them back out with the link to this recording. Okay, I wanted to acknowledge the work of the White River Alliance in terms of the Indiana Water Summit. So this forum is an extension of the Indiana Water Summit. Oftentimes we have topics that we want to cover at the Water Summit, but like this one, are pretty detailed or need the help of some experts to really unwind the science. And so we like to host these more in-depth discussions for that reason. And also so that some of our audiences can self-select to topics that they're really interested in. We were originally hoping to have a number of the legislators interested in regulation and all of the things associated with PFAS. We have a number of legislators that have brought different pieces of policy forward. Many of them are now in another meeting that has come up since we scheduled this date, but I did see at least Mike Aylesworth was on here for a little while, or someone from his office. So I just want to acknowledge our state leaders that couldn't be here, but have a lot of interest in this topic. So we look forward to you guys downloading and sharing the recording as well among your colleagues. I'd also like to recognize and hand the mic off to a friend and colleague of mine, Lynn Damon from Purdue University. Lynn is with the Center for the Environment, and we are partnering with them on this event. It's a great way to get the science out of the university and into our community. So we're just really grateful for the researchers and for Lynn helping to organize this and participate in it and bringing us some good science to our discussion. So Lynn, I'll let you do a quick introduction. You're going to do our speaker introductions as well today, right?
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much for the introduction. And we're very excited to be working with Jill and the White River Alliance on this project. It's been a long time in the making. Also, like a shout out that we also have introducing Sarah McMillan to the Wetlands Task Force as well, representing the center. So we're very excited for that. And we will be having our next event in October together covering that topic. So just a pre-shout out for that. I am going to go ahead and just briefly introduce our three panelists, our science panelists today. And I'm going to introduce them kind of all at once, and then Jill will go ahead and introduce them one by one as they speak. Our first speaker will be Dr. Linda Lee, who is a professor of agronomy, environmental and ecological engineering, and she's also the program head for the Ecological Sciences and Engineering Interdisciplinary Graduate Program at Purdue. So a great friend and partner of the center. And her research focus is on developing a mechanistic understanding of the processes that govern the environmental fate and possible remediation of contaminants. And I'll let her go into that more detail, but she is a leading national expert on PFAS and remediation in all sorts of different avenues of water and biosolids and soil and water. And so it's really exciting to have her on this call to talk about PFAS, especially about impacts and potential impacts in Indiana. Our second speaker is Dr. Jennifer Freeman, who is also the interim director of the Center for the Environment, and she is a professor of toxicology in the School of Health Sciences. And she looks to define underlying genetic and epigenetic mechanism of toxicity, of which PFAS is one, and related environmental stressors and how they impact human health outcomes. And we are also very excited to join with us our PFAS partner in crime, Dr. Graham Peasley from University of Notre Dame. And among his many research interests is measurement methods and materials that impact society that also include various consumer products that are impacted by PFAS, the subject of the day. So I will leave it there and hand it back over to Jill, and we'll start with Dr. Lee.
Well, I'm going to just pass that baton right over to Linda. Linda, you should be all set up there with some co-host abilities, and thank you for joining us and kicking this off today. Please give us our PFAS 101.
Okay, well, I was given a tall task, and so I'm going to just cruise through some things, and we have a very diverse audience. Some of you know a lot about PFAS and some don't, so forgive me if you're bored and forgive me if you are overwhelmed. Okay. So I'm going to just cover a few basics and then highlight some sources. I'll talk about drinking water guidelines and kind of a synopsis of where we are on treatment, and then talk about PFAS during wastewater treatment, which is a good way to talk about fate. I'm not going to go into environmental fate once it's released into the environment. That gets to be a whole talk. All these are talks all by themselves, and then mention a little bit on biosolids treatment and kind of my perspective forward. So currently we have about 5,000 plus PFAS that we know are commercially produced, and it can feel like an alphabet soup, even to scientists that study PFAS. It gets pretty overwhelming. And so on the right, you see a tree back from a 2017 paper, but just let's highlight a few important things. So first of all, they all contain a perfluorocarbon, usually a perfluoroalkyl chain. Second, and you can see here, so we have where I just put these circles up, they all have different chain lengths or have this perfluoro chain. And then there's numerous subclasses. So every one of those red circles are kind of highlighting a perfluoroalkyl chain within a different subclass. And then each subclass has a differentiating characteristic, whether it has to do with the chemistry usually of the polar group, but sometimes even the chain. But then within each one, so you see these, we have these different, we don't want to do too much chemistry and you'll be sad. But within each one of those subgroups, you end up with multiple PFAS of several different chain lengths, as you can see here. And so you can quickly see why we can get into the thousands in no time at all. So I'm showing you here for this subclass. Here's another example, but every one of these subclasses, you'll have multiple chain lengths. And then you can even have different isomers in these different categories. So it's quickly easy to see how we get so many. And now our manufacturers are getting increasingly more innovative at trying to create replacement compounds for the PFAS, but almost all the time, those replacements really are just another PFAS. And what's most significant about PFAS is that they either do not degrade naturally or they degrade to just another subclass of PFAS. And so I'll show you an example of that. Here's a cartoon example. So here's just two types of PFAS molecules from different types of production processes. And we call these, a lot of times these will be called precursors. So when people are talking about precursor PFAS, they're PFAS, but they're precursors to what we know to be terminal end products from microbial degradation. So these precursors can undergo microbial degradation through multiple steps and pathways and rates, and then they end up to some terminal compound. We call those terminal perfluoroalkyl acids. I'm just showing you two as examples that have garnered the most attention, PFOA and PFOS, but those are really just the tip of the iceberg, we know now. And these acids are persistent in that they're terminal microbial metabolites. They're more soluble, they're mobile, so this is why they're so widespread. And because of that perfluoroalkyl chain, they're also bioaccumulative. And so herein lies our problem. And when we're looking at the PFAS, we have to realize there's multiple uses, multiple sources. And so, we hear a lot about fire training airports and fire training homes that get used to put out hydrocarbon fires. They save lives, but unfortunately, the PFAS that help them to save lives are persistent and they get out in the environment. We have lots of different industry that use them in their process or as coatings. We have textiles and carpets and leathers that we all have in our homes, our cars, paper and packaging products, including packaging products for food, So as I'm saying some of these, you're probably thinking, why aren't these regulated out of our packaging materials for food? But, this is our challenges. Even cosmetics and personal care products, Dr. Peasley will get to highlight some of the low PFAS in those from his technologies. Floor polishes, coatings, cleaning agents, automobile ski waxes, lots of different kinds of fluids, anything that needs to be thermally stable or allow for water resistance or stain resistance. You can almost count on PFAS being present in them. And now we know they're even in our carriers for our pesticides because they're surfactants, so they enhance dispersion of other chemicals and distribution. They're also in the containers that contain our pesticides. They're coatings in the containers, to keep the pesticides from doing anything to get out. But now that means that even those pesticides can have them. And flame retardants, there's just such a list, we can go forever. And so obviously our wastes end up in a few different places. One's the landfill, both domestic, industrial, and different commercial things end up in the landfills, and those then will leach PFAS. The other thing that's a conduit of our waste, it's really our fingerprint, is our water resource recovery facilities, better known as wastewater treatment plants. And I will show you an example of PFAS essentially going, they're going to be present. They're going to come in from multiple sources. They're going to go out either through effluent or biosolids. And then now one of the efforts that is being funded by a lot of different groups is looking at if land applied biosolids or composted materials that contain food packaging materials are the PFAS loads in those good reuse of waste that we use as fertilizer, contributing to our PFAS loads in our groundwater and surface water. So probably most of you know there is a variety of reactions to what is acceptable, and Dr. Freeman will talk more about effects. But honestly, we don't have a clear handle all around about what is, and depending on what assumptions people use in their modeling to come up with a predictive level, they're all over the board. And so you can see here a few examples: Michigan, Maine and Vermont and California, that range all the way from single-digit part per trillion to, in the example of Canada as another North American continent country, 200 parts per trillion PFOA and 600 parts per trillion PFOS. And so this is also a challenge because this is very regional and state specific. EPA, they're doing their best to try to lead some guidance here, and we keep increasing the number of PFAS that will be looked at in the unregulated contaminant rule. And so we have, as of May 2016, 6 PFAS proposed in March 2021, with a final ruling expected this year, is going from the 6 in 2016, which was originally only 2, to 29 PFAS. And so this is, it's a daunting task all the way around, from producing products that we find very useful, but unfortunately carry these persistent chemicals, all the way to the treatment end. So when we're thinking about water treatment, so I'm just going to highlight one synopsis on drinking water and full-scale conventional treatments. Pretty much for the full-scale conventional treatments, none of the typical oxidation processes or physical separation processes are effective at all at removing PFAS. Now, we do have some with, full-scale granulated activated carbon and different ion exchange resins. Those are effective at removing the longer chain PFAS. Now, for how long, the longevity of those columns before they have to be replaced, that's a challenge. But they're not helping for our shorter chain, which are even more mobile, and it's very dependent on other things that might be present in the water that they're trying to clean up. So that's what I mean by matrix dependent. And in those sorptive technologies, these are all sorptive. There's lots of different types, particle sizes, and some will also couple it to some type of degradation treatment. And then I get asked about plume stop a lot. That has a bio piece as well, but essentially all these are PFAS. For PFAS are only adsorption. So they have different treatments, but the treatments don't really address PFAS right now. It's good to know that reverse osmosis and nanofiltration really do a really good job at removing most of the PFAS, but unfortunately they create a large waste volume of concentrated PFAS that then has to be dealt with. There's a lot of advanced oxidative and reductive treatment strategies that are being researched right now. There have been several ongoing CERTUP projects that are still ongoing. There's now some EPA projects, and most recently, NSF Race PFAS initiative funded several projects. And so most of the things that are used at full scale is removal, not destruction. And even for RO and nanofiltration, which does a good job to remove it from the water that we will drink, unfortunately, it still leads to a waste that has to be dealt with. So there's no silver bullet when it comes to addressing these in our water systems. So what about wastewater management? So I talked about there's multiple PFAS. That's really just multiple sources, industry, landfill, and domestic use, all coming into our plants through wastewater influent. Many sources, we're all responsible. It's just a fingerprint of our style of living. And then different plants have different treatment processes, different stages within their plants. But in the end, the PFAS are pretty much going to either sorb to the sludge or end up in the effluent that's discharged to streams. I would say, for example, in Michigan's effort, there's a lot of effort to reduce PFAS discharge into the streams. Michigan also has a pretty concerted effort to try to identify non-domestic sources, particularly industry, that might use PFAS in their processing and might be contributing a large load to their plants. They're assessing that in advance. If it passes, if it exceeds their criteria, and they're going to talk later, so I won't talk about that, then the industry is forced to pre-treat, just like in the days of metals, which really helped to reduce metals that ended up in biosolids. And that's where the sludge then gets treated further, get rid of pathogens and a few other things, but it doesn't really address organic chemicals where PFAS falls into. And then our biosolids are land applied. And biosolids are a really great soil amendment. And I've said this is the one-time research with climate change initiatives and now chemicals of concern kind of overlap, because everything you want to do to the biosolids really does impact climate change initiatives, because biosolids are a great carbon sequestration source, a slow release nutrient source. So it affects nutrient release to our streams. And so you have whole groups working on nutrient release. Well, this all comes together now when we're talking about PFAS and restrictions on biosolid applications. So the truth is, things come in, things go out. They might change in the process because PFAS might be broken down, but just to other PFAS. But in the end, we end up with not really changing our fluorine mole balance. We do change the number of compounds that we see because we only quantify a subset. And I'm going to give you one example of that. Oh, here we go. So here's an example of a FATE example within the wastewater treatment plant, but it actually speaks well for what might happen in the environment. Here you see we have, this is just a cumulative amount of PFAS. I'm just showing you different PFAS here that we've analyzed for, but don't be overwhelmed by that. The important thing that you see is that we go from, post is much greater than pre. And some of that is just from solids reduction, because you do lose some carbon. So you can have a twofold increase if nothing else is happening just from that solids reduction. Some of the alkyl acids that we refer to as the terminal PFAS, those can increase, even more than what you might see in solids reduction. Even more so, these in-between microbial metabolites that are not monitored in any of the current commercial lab suites of PFAS analytes, they can increase by a factor of 10 or more. I gave you two examples here, 10 and 14 for two of these acids. And then some of the precursors, and one example is 6,2-fluorotellumer sulfonate, these will decrease because of what I showed you before. Microbial processes are converting things, going towards these terminal acids with lots of in-between microbial metabolites. And basically, precursor breakdown leads to more PFAS that are being quantified. I didn't show you the aerobic process only because probably more wastewater treatment processes are anaerobic, but under aerobic conditions, which would be also after you land apply or after it gets discharged into an aerobic environment, aerobic treatment leads to much more PFAS, but just the PFAS that we quantify. So that's what's important to realize. We can increase the number of PFAS molecules, but the total fluorine mole balance is not changing very much, just what we're measuring. So here's an example. I'm showing you a lot in this slide. First, I just want to show this is for 2019 biosolids that were from treatment plants that ranged quite a large range in the populations they served as well as their treatment process. And really you go for, maybe a couple hundred to 900 ppb PFAS of what we monitored, which was 41. Remember, there's thousands out there. Most people are maybe looking at 24 if that's their commercial suite. But we don't see, maybe a factor of, less than 5 between these different plants. So that was kind of surprising. But then if you look at the individual PFAS, and I just highlighted the orange ones are those terminal ones I talk about, they vary a lot. And that's going to be a function primarily of the source coming in, but also a little bit of the treatment process. And these other ones that I'm showing you are all precursors or metabolites on the way to these alkyl acids. And so they range a lot. And then in addition to that, and very few people are monitoring these, we only have standards for a couple of these, but we can use those standards to quantify a suite of these. These are called, this is another subclass. This is representing 2 subclasses of PFAS that have phosphorus in them. And you can see that they are actually even much higher concentration, and nobody's capturing these. So overall, we see that this is like up 50% of the contribution of what we're measuring in 41. And then in the study on the left, I'm showing you that 7 of these biosolids were used in outsized mesocosm, so I can show you leaching. And what we see is the carboxylic acids that are like PFOA that you're familiar with are much more leach out than what we measure in the beginning in the initial biosolid. And that's because all these precursors are degrading, and most of them degrade to carboxylic acids. And so, for example, we saw a huge decrease in these PAPs and dipaps that were present, and that's because they are being converted during normal aerobic biodegradation processes to these carboxylic acids, which now are terminal and more mobile. And then overall, if we do a fluorine mole balance, an organofluorine mole balance on these biosolids, it's really less than 5% of the total organofluorine present. And yes, there can be other molecules, pharmaceuticals, pesticides that have fluorine in them, so they're not all PFAS, but I suspect they are mostly PFAS. And then drinking water really pushes the levels that are acceptable in biosolids, and not as many states have moved on this. And again, I'm showing you that you have several different highly varying levels that are being found to be acceptable. And this is really driven by the modeling that's done and the assumptions that are done. So the New York levels, their preliminary screening levels that they recommend before, prior to land application, those can mostly be met by all the biosolids I've looked at. And then the ones by Maine, the 2 criteria for PFOA and PFAS rarely are met in any of the biosolids that I've looked at in the last 2 years. So what about treatment for those? So we can have, we looked at a lot of different treatment, but basically, and we didn't do the treatment ourselves. This was the actual facilities that did biosolid treatment to further treat the biosolid, and really only blending works. So blending is a very pragmatic way to be addressing biosolid issues. Let's blend let's not ban land application right now. Let's blend them with with things that don't contain PFAS, which is hard to find, but low amounts of PFAS. We've done other work on pyrolysis, where we see that even low temperature pyrolysis will might not get rid of the PFAS, but it makes it so it does not leach. It basically, low single digits of even the shorter chain PFAS will leach after a pyrolysis. We've also looked at a lot of sorption mitigated things where we might mix biosolids with biochar or alum drinking water residuals. And all of these show a lot of promise. And that's because we really need multiple, we can't just use one hammer for this problem. So just in ending in my path forward, because it's my 20 minutes, I don't really support banning land application because of all the numerous unintended consequences. So what we need to do is control the sources. Everybody needs to play a role in pushing legislative, locally, regionally, and at our national level to reduce, to regulate out non-essential uses. We have to keep doing research in all of our different disciplines so that we have the tools to make right decisions. And we need to be adaptable. None of our plans are going to be one fix, this fix all. We really have to be adaptable. And I'm just giving an example here for biosolids, but across the board, even for treatment. So I'm going to leave it at that. It's all yours, Jen.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Linda. Man, I'm sure everybody's in the same space, but our heads over here at the office are spinning a little bit. Kelly and I are having some twitching PTSD from organic chemistry kind of coming back at us, but I can appreciate. Thank you for all of the cool new words we learned today. Thanks, Linda. I know we asked you to do the impossible, which is take thousands of things and explain them in 20 minutes. But
yeah, you gave me the title and I was like, really? All those things?
All those things. Well, we know that this is just the first of our discussions on this topic, Linda. So thanks for introducing us to the huge number of sources and variations and chemicals themselves and where we're seeing it in our wastewater and what some of the applications are for treatment. So that was a lot in 20 minutes. For those of you that are new to this topic, hang on, because we have more speakers that will help us take this a couple next steps, including into health effects. So with that, I'd like to hand things over to Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer. Thanks for being here. She's going to share some toxicity information with us, right?
Yes.
Okay, it's all yours.
All right. You can see my screen okay there. Well, thank you for this opportunity to talk with you all today. I'm going to be talking about why we're concerned about PFAS exposure and human health impacts. I'm going to spend a little time talking about some of the historic studies where we got our initial information about what types of adverse health outcomes we may observe with PFAS exposure, and talk about where we are currently and where we're moving in the direction in the future to try and address some of these challenges that we have. So this diagram should be similar to what Dr. Lee just showed you, showing you all the different sources in which these PFAS are being put into our environment. And that is always a red flag for us in environmental health when we see that there are these multiple sources in which we may be exposed to these different PFAS, and indicating that we need to think about all the different exposure routes and what type of exposures we may be getting from all these different sources. So for these PFAS, one of the main routes of exposure is through our diet. And Dr. Peasley is going to talk to you specifically about the detection of these products and a lot of our food products, and how they're found in our fast food packaging, pizza boxes, and popcorn bags, and how that can translate to us being exposed to them. But also, as Dr. Lee was mentioning, one of our major sources of exposure in the environment is through our contaminated drinking water. So we have all of these different exposure routes that we're being submitted to through our diet, in which we can have some interface with those PFAS compounds. So as a result, what we have seen through different research studies is that currently in the US, over 90% of Americans have some PFAS in their blood. And this is just, again, confirming that yes, those PFAS are out in the environment and we are having them present in our bodies. As such, we need to be concerned to try and address whether or not we may have adverse health outcomes from these exposures to these different PFAS. And if we do, what are those specific adverse health effects, and at what kind of concentrations and doses do we start to see those specific adverse health outcomes? And as Dr. Lee was mentioning, these found in a widespread variety of products. They can be globally transported. So these two characteristics help to really just increase the risk that we are going to be exposed to them. As Dr. Lee also mentioned, these PFAS do not break down in the environment, so they persist. And as such, this is another increasing factor that leads to us being exposed to them. Studies have also shown that repeated exposure over time can result in these PFAS building up in the tissues of humans and what we call bioaccumulation. So over your life, as you have continual exposure to these PFAS, you would expect higher doses that are going to be found within your tissues. And that becomes a concern as we start to see just that increased dose offering an increased risk for having adverse health outcomes. Furthermore, studies have shown that PFAS are present in human breast milk and that they're also found in umbilical cord blood. So that's important because then we start to consider and be concerned about developmental exposures, including both those in utero exposures and also early development. And we're concerned about those exposures specifically because we know that the developmental phase is one of the most susceptible to any sort of toxicant perturbation. And so we want to address that concern and understand whether or not we may be seeing some developmental toxicity occur in addition to what we may see in an adult or a mature organism. What we initially found out about the PFAS adverse health outcomes was due to one of the largest human epidemiological environmental studies that has been done. This was a study that was conducted between 2005 and 2013. It was called the C8 Science Panel. It was called C8 because it focused on one of the specific PFAS known as PFOA, or perfluorooctanoic acid. You have the chemical structure here, more chemical structures being thrown your way, but this compound is routinely called C8 because it has 8 carbons found in its chain. This PFOA exposure was primarily from release from a Washington Works plant around Parkersburg, West Virginia. This plant released PFOA into the air and also as effluent into the Ohio River. And the PFOA was released from the 1950s until the early 2000s. So in this study, researchers enrolled over 69,000 people. All of those that were involved were over 18 years of age. And one of the important things to point out is that within environmental health and toxicology, when we're talking about adverse health outcomes and health risks, we always want to anchor that to an exposure dose. And for this specific study, we knew that it was a little bit of a higher exposure in this population because of the exposures they were getting around this specific emissions that were coming from this plant. And so this population was found to have PFOA in their blood over about 5 times what is found in the general US population. Through this study, they had some major findings indicating some specific adverse health outcomes that were related with this PFOA exposure. This included high incidence of high cholesterol in this population, inflammatory bowel disease that was found in the population, thyroid disease, testicular and kidney cancers were higher in this population. And they also noted an increase of pregnancy-induced hypertension. And this is important because you can have additional stress onto the mother while she's carrying the baby. And then so it can also have some additional adverse developmental effects from that hypertension that might be present. So since that time, there's been a number of other human epidemiological studies that have been done. And I'll just say that if you're not familiar with epidemiology, it just means we're looking at exposures within a human population to come to some terms about these adverse health outcomes that might be present. So there's been additional studies done with both PFOA, so continuing with that compound, and then also looking at PFAS. PFAS is also an 8 carbon chain length PFAS. It has those 8 carbons that are present there. And it has been generally of more concern than PFOA because it's found to be even more bioaccumulative and to be found at higher concentrations in the environment and also in the blood of humans. So these additional studies have pointed out that there is an increased risk of low infant birth weights, specific effects on the immune system, which Dr. Peasley is going to talk a little bit more about in his talk, additional impacts to the thyroid hormones disruption, and also changes in liver enzymes. And the last one is important because our liver is the major organ that's going to be doing all the metabolism for our body. So if we are changing the way that we are metabolizing different compounds, this can also alter our risk of adverse health outcomes, because we may have slower metabolism, which would result in slower release or elimination of those compounds from our body, meaning they're staying longer in our body, and thus we're being exposed to them for longer. From those initial epidemiological studies that were being conducted, there was an action that was put into place. This action was called the PFAS Stewardship Program, and the focus of this program was to eliminate emissions in products with those 8 carbon chain PFAS, so PFOA and PFAS, and also the higher homologs by 2015. And so the higher homologs are just those longer chain PFAS. And the data that was collected after and through this PFAS stewardship program looked really optimal, in which we saw a great reduction in the amount of PFOA and PFAS that was found in human blood. This graph is showing you data that was collected from the CDC through some of their monitoring programs, where you can see there was over 80% reduction of PFAS in human blood. That's the green line on the graph. And then there was over 60% reduction of PFOA. And I think this is a great example of how we can take certain actions and they can have a direct result on our human exposure levels, and thus drastically decreasing our risk of having adverse health outcomes from these exposures. But through that PFAS stewardship program, and as Dr. Lee was mentioning, we've seen additional number of PFAS replacements then that have come onto the market and are being used in a number of consumer products. And the number, some say 4,000, Dr. Lee said over 5,000. You know, there's a little bit of fluctuation, but the take home is that there are a lot of PFAS compounds that we're concerned with. And when that comes to looking at human health outcomes, it means we need to be doing either exposure assessment studies or toxicology-based studies where we're doing lab assessments of the toxicity of these compounds, so that we can be informed and know more about what their toxicity risk is and more about the risk of adverse human health outcomes. And this really is just a very challenging question because of the great number of different chemicals we are trying to understand what their toxicity is. And on this slide, what I'm showing you is that those PFAS compound and PFOA compound, those 8 carbon chain length, they have been replaced with chemicals that have 4 carbons. So the PFBS is for PFAS, or PFBA is for PFOA, but really the take home is that these are shorter chain, only 4 carbons. And those were chosen because they were thought to not bioaccumulate as much, and that we would be able to not stay in our bodies as longer, which is a benefit. In addition to the shorter chain replacements, we also see replacements going on the market that have different sort of chains put on their chemical structure. And one of those, and that has been in the public press quite a bit, is a replacement for PFOA known as Gen X. And you can see it has somewhat of a complex chemical structure. So what does this mean for human health? It means that we have a lot of additional questions, understanding the toxicity of all of these different replacements that are going onto the market, more than just PFBS, PFBA, and Gen X, and trying to understand the real risk of human health, adverse health outcomes with our exposure to them. Some examples, and really just to illustrate the limitation of data that we're currently faced with, and that the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease, or registry, the ATSDR, which is out of the CDC, they just released in May the toxicity of 10 different PFAS compounds. And the US EPA has a working toxicity profile that they're working on for about 40 PFAS. So we're gaining information, but unfortunately, this number is really low and really limited when we're looking at the total amount of PFAS that are being used and that we are being exposed. And so it definitely is a challenging question that we're addressing. Now, some of those studies that have been completed with some of these replacements are trying to determine if the toxicity of these replacements are less, equal, compared to what PFOA and PFAS were. And unfortunately, what we do see is that a number of these PFAS replacements seem to have similar adverse health outcomes associated with them and similar toxicities that are associated with them. We find that some of these toxicities or adverse health outcomes are found in both sexes, such as an increase in cholesterol levels, increased cancer risk, altered metabolism that I was mentioning before, reduction in immune system function, and one of those includes a reduction in our vaccine response, and that's been of quite some interest recently in the COVID pandemic. Increase in thyroid disease that is found in both sexes. And then we find some of these outcomes are just sex specific. And that really highlights the importance of addressing the adverse health outcomes in males and females individually, just given our physiological differences. And so women have been found to have an increased risk of diabetes. We've been found that it's been an endocrine disruptor, so it's somehow interfering with our hormones and endocrine system. It can reduce the chance of women getting pregnant and that increased risk of hypertension during pregnancy. We also see looking at during pregnancy can lead to a reduction in fetal growth, which could have a variety of different negative impacts on the child. In addition, these studies have moved into specifically looking at exposures during the developmental periods and have reported an increased risk of child obesity with the exposure to some of the PFAS replacements, and also a number of growth related to the endocrine system disruption, and also some alterations potentially in behavior and learning that could be related to impacts to the central nervous system. So these studies are ongoing. There's a great task and challenge that is put into place today within environmental health to try and understand these PFAS. And I've just included on the slide a couple examples of these ongoing human epidemiological studies. One is a study that's being led by the ATSDR, where they have multiple sites that are being involved. They have 7 different partners, and they're specifically looking at PFAS in the drinking water and adverse health outcomes in the human population. Another study called the Gen X exposure study is specifically looking at Gen X and other related PFAS and their potential for adverse health outcomes in a population specifically located around the lower Cape Fear River Basin, which had to do with some contamination issues around the Chemours plant that was there. So in these epidemiological studies, there's a number of questions that they're trying to address and trying to get answers so that we can better understand these health effects. These include understanding how long the PFAS stay in the body. This is comparing to what we found for PFOA and PFAS, and I've included some of the numbers here, which look promising. And we can see that PFOA, which can stay in the human body from 2 to 10 years. If you look at its shorter chain replacement, PFBA, it moves to only 72 to 81 hours. If you look at PFAS, which could stay in the human body 3 to 27 years, its 4-chain replacement moves to 665 hours. And so that's a good sign, because it means that these PFAS chemicals won't stay in our body as long. But you can't overlook the fact that we're being repeatedly exposed to them. And so you have to take that into account too, of just realizing, what our body burden is going to be. They're also looking at the specific types of adverse health effects that are being observed from these PFAS alternatives, identifying whether or not they're going to see similar sorts of adverse health outcomes, maybe no adverse health outcomes, which would be ideal, or do they see different types of adverse health outcomes? One of those important aspects is we know that usually smaller chemical structures, such as like PFBA, they can have a tendency to get into different tissues that the longer or the larger chemical structures may not. And so one example of that is crossing the blood-brain barrier and the potential for getting to the brain. And so there's a lot of studies right now looking at a lot of these smaller PFAS chemicals and whether or not they may be able to more easily pass into the brain and cause a more significant neurotoxicity than what has been detected previously with PFOA and PFAS. And then also just relating it back to how much of the chemical do we need to have in our body to see those adverse health outcomes. So understanding the relationship between the dose that we actually have in our body. These studies are including multiple life stages and also those sex-specific effects that I was talking about earlier. And just another image outlining the number of different health outcomes that have been associated with PFAS exposure, and those dotted lines looking into more of the current areas that are being being more investigated to see whether or not there may be some association with PFAS exposure and those health outcomes too. In addition, there are a number of laboratory studies that are being completed. So the laboratory studies allow us to have a controlled environment where we can use either cell-based systems, or we can use a number of different whole animal model organisms to address varying circumstances and characteristics to better understand toxicity of the PFAS and also adverse health outcomes related to that PFAS exposure. So they're addressing a number of different PFAS replacements, exploring a number of different additional health outcomes that weren't initially identified in those earlier studies, just to see if there are additional health outcomes we may need to be exploring or looking at, understanding that dose response of how much of that chemical it takes to have the effect, and again, multiple life stages and sex-specific effects. We do see that researchers and regulatory agencies are putting into place a number of improved approaches for trying to work through this large number of PFAS chemicals. One of those includes what's called computational toxicology. So this is just the use of different computer tools to be able to look at those chemical structures of the different PFAS so that they can prioritize which PFAS they want to carry out in additional toxicity studies that may be of a higher risk to have some sort of adverse health outcome associated with them. We also have seen the development of a number of high throughput toxicology tools. This just means that there are quicker, more efficient, rapid ways to be able to assess toxicity. These are using different cell-based assays, and they're also using different whole organisms. And historically, most of the toxicity studies have used rodents, but we see different organisms such as the zebrafish being applied in these studies to be able to use these multi-well plate setups that's shown on the slide, where we can address an additional number of concentrations of different PFAS and a number of different PFAS at one time. And overall, the goal of just being able to get more data and to have a better understanding of the toxicity of these different PFAS. And so while we've made, I think, some great strides, there are just a number of challenges that we face. A lot of these are around just the sheer number of chemical compounds that we are dealing with. I think one of the great things that we've seen was through that PFOA stewardship program, where we've seen that decrease in the blood of PFOA and PFAS after the phasing out. But those questions still remain about what types and what concentrations of these PFAS replacements we're going to find in the blood, especially as their use changes in the different products. There's these additional questions and just really gaining the need to gain more information about the toxicity of all these different PFAS replacements that are being used in these consumer products and that we're being exposed to, whether or not we're going to see similar sorts of adverse health outcomes, and also really linking it to the dose. So how much of those different compounds does it take for us to see these adverse health outcomes? And how does that relate then to how much we are being exposed or how much is being found in our body? And lastly, just thinking about approaches for regulation. And Linda mentioned this too, and you saw those different varieties that different states were putting into place and different considerations of whether we should stick with a single chemical approach that we've used historically for setting those drinking water standards, or is it time for us to think about a class-based or thinking about multiple PFAS at one time as we work to try to understand and get a grasp on all these different PFAS chemicals. So I will wrap up there and thank you for the time to share this information.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Really appreciate that. We're running just a little behind, so I'm going to save my editorial comments and questions for you until later. I did just want to please encourage all the participants. I know we're throwing a lot of science at you pretty quickly. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to put those in the chat, even if they seem remedial, because some of us will be glad to see those as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Graham. Graham, thank you for joining us from Notre Dame. Appreciate you being here. The floor is yours.
Let me unmute myself and turn on a face, so you should be able to see that. And you should be able to see, I'm hoping, the presentation. Did I do that right? Very good. Thanks to everybody for organizing this and inviting me. And if you haven't figured out by now, they don't invite Linda and Jennifer and I to speak very often, at least not twice, because we can draw a lot of information in a very short period of time. And it's pretty depressing. I mean, these chemicals are everywhere. They're used in all sorts of common goods. They're used in firefighting foam that gets in the water that we drink. They're in all the Teflon that we ever made, and the Gore-Tex jackets, and of course, Scotchgard in our carpets. And those are the common stories that everybody knows about. And of course, microwave popcorn. Why wouldn't you put it there? Well, it's the best surfactant we ever made. And Linda went through a wonderful set of characteristics that make these chemicals so special. Why they're in our popcorn in 2021 is a very good question, since it was banned in Denmark in 2014, and an American company came up with an alternative in 2015. But until this year, it hasn't been available in this country. So there's lots of stories there, and I'm going to concentrate on just a few of them associated with things that relate to you, the consumers. But it's related to, as you can tell, ag, what you put on ag fields, because it's bioaccumulative. And all of these represent exposure risks. And I'm going to base a lot of this off of what a paper came out just last year by Gluge and company on an overview of where these substances were. They did an inventive thing. They looked at the patent licenses of all the products they could find, and they found PFAS, 1,400 PFAS listed on patent licenses. There may be 4,000 of them out there, but at least 1,400 of them are in patents for a product. And that means there's over 200 uses listed on these patents for what they would be used in. And if you think about that, that's a really broad spectrum of things that we use these products in. And of course, they don't just stay in the product, they can come out as well. And this was the slide that Linda showed and that Jennifer reminded us of, that it can go through what the initial production was, through a landfill into the drinking water, or it can get into the food and into the people. It can go directly from the clothing into you, or food packaging, for example, if you eat the popcorn, or the firefighting foams. And all these things are in a closed cycle that we call the ecosystem. And they pass right through the wastewater treatment plants. They pass through what we are designed to protect ourselves from these things. And so I want to leave you with not just the doom and gloom of, oh my God, we're surrounded by these things. I'd like to show you some of the successes we've had in curtailing their uses. And that comes from a sort of combination of science and policy. One of the first things to realize is that there are nonprofit groups out there putting wonderful maps like this, which show that PFAS are either not equally distributed or at least not equally looked for. You can see Indiana is PFAS free. Isn't that nice? Well, the reason is that PFAS doesn't read that the no admittance to Indiana on the border. It just hasn't been looked for. In Michigan is PFAS central because they've had several multiple contaminations, and they put a lot of state money into studying it. And that last presentation that Jennifer just referred to had a big cohort in Cape Fear, North Carolina. Well, that's a wonderful name for a chemical spill, but Cape Fear is where it is. And the state has now begun to study its water supply, as has New Jersey for many years, and at least St. Paul, Minneapolis, where 3M is located. And so you can see these hotspots around the country, and we are all very suspicious that as the other 47 states begin to look, we're going to see the entire country covered with these things. The EPA spokespeople have literally said this is the largest contamination the US has ever faced, and the most recalcitrant in terms of trying to get rid of. And one thing that Jennifer also led to is that we're all exposed to this, and the exposure routes are different. There's a wonderful need in industry to keep on using this material. It's very good at what it does. So they keep on swapping to replacements, and they keep on telling us the replacements are safe. And there was a lot of preliminary evidence that shows almost all the replacements. Well, what we can say, I've never met a good PFAS yet in terms of exposure and human health effects. And it does appear that these categories have the same sort of health outcomes, negative health outcomes. But here's a great example that just came out this year based on COVID. And it wasn't what was expected. Philip Grandjean did the study on the Danish COVID patients, and he looked at what happens to the outcomes of COVID patients. And some of them are not even hospitalized, and they don't have very high PFAS levels. And the PFAS levels were not related to COVID, except for the C4 PFAS, PFBA, this one shown on the top right. And the reason is that as you had more C4 in your blood, and remember, that's the one that was really safe. That only lasts days in your blood, not years. But to replace C8 in our clothing, we have to put in about 10,000 times as much C4, or maybe only 1,000 times as much C4. And that 1,000 times as much C4 comes off more easily. It gets through skin and inhaled more easily. And in our bodies, it's extruded through the lungs. And that doesn't really matter, does it? I mean, it's out of your body. It can't do any harm. Well, it was until we had, well, guess what? A global pandemic of respiratory virus. Who ever thought that would happen? Well, some people did, but in this case, the fluid of the lungs surfactants is likely to be compromised, and that has a negative outcome when you catch COVID. And you can see that the ICU treated and the deceased are the highest in PFBA. And there was a correlation. So this is one of the things about immunosuppressants and this particular disease, but it's just an insidious toxin, and we can't predict how it's going to happen. We can make some guesses. And my contribution into this field is I'm late to the field. I've only studied it for the last 5 or 6 years. But I have a technique which is nuclear in nature. This is my own particle accelerator downstairs. The nuclear science lab at Notre Dame has several of them. And we're using this to do applied science. We're trying to find ways to rapidly measure PFAS because, as Linda described quite correctly, it's really difficult to measure 4,700 types. We only have standards for about 100 of them or less commercially available. And so you have to work pretty hard to identify some of these unknown ones. So what I do is I cheat and I look at where fluorine is. And you can measure fluorine more quickly and more easily. You need a particle accelerator to do it or a reactor, none of which are terribly portable yet. But you can look at samples in 180 seconds and see the fluorine content. And it doesn't matter what sample it is, I can look at it. And if it has no fluorine, there are no PFAS in it. That's the screening concept. And here's an example on the lower right of what a spectrum looks like with a popcorn bag versus copier paper. And copier paper does have no fluorine in it, and the popcorn bag is loaded with it. And we get a very robust signature that we can quantify and say this is how much is in there. We just say it's fluorine. We don't know it's PFAS per se. There could be inorganic fluoride, but inorganic fluoride only occurs in a few systems where we intentionally put it or in the dirt. And if it doesn't have a lot of dirt, it generally is PFAS. And that's what we've done with our studies. So what can we do with a rapid screening technique? Well, there were references to this before. We can measure things, and this was student driven. We went out and measured a bunch of fast food wrappers, and this was published in 2017, and it drew a lot of attention. There was newspaper articles. We never intended quite that much, but it was interesting. People were fascinated by the, I got a satire in the Onion. Never had that before. Never eaten another wrapper in my life. Well, it's true that people weren't expecting this, but it had an impact. And that's what I more or less changed my research directive when this happened, is because when this came out, the 20 companies named, from McDonald's to Panera to Starbucks to Jimmy John's, and all these companies got a letter from a US senator saying, I understand from the Washington Post you use this in your packaging. What's your policy for removing it, and how soon will it be done? And when a company receives that letter, and they sell tacos, they sell hamburgers, they sell French fries, they don't really want to worry about packaging. 20 out of 20 companies switched to a non-fluorinated packaging in a year and a half, as far as we can tell. Only one admitted to it. McDonald's said they were sorry. They had thought they'd got rid of it. Now they have. All the rest didn't admit it. But we've done more sampling since that time, and these brands are remarkably fluorine-free. The papers are anyway. And we think that significant burden is already in the landfill for the ones already made, but the packaging doesn't last long. And in fact, this doesn't transfer readily to the food. If you're like my house, the fast food doesn't last more than 30 seconds before the teenagers gobble it. So they're not getting it from the packaging on the food directly, but 100% of the paper goes into the landfill in this country. And 100% of it will aerobically or anaerobically degrade in 60 days in the landfill. And 100% of those chemicals are in your drinking water. So we're all drinking it. And that's the scary part. And so this type of paper came out, and it had an impact because it was brand shaming. These brands were caught putting something in their paper that they didn't want, and they all switched away from it. It costs more to put this stuff on. The only reason they were doing it was that it was a better shield against grease. But you can also put 2 layers of paper, or you could go with a polyethylene liner, or you could just use double wrappers. And many of them did. And what we saw was a change that was quicker than anything we could legislate or regulate. The companies made the decision for their consumers, I don't want to be associated with a negative compound. We're just switching away from it. And there was a cheaper alternative available, and most of them did. Second study that came out was last year's, was another one about occupational exposure for firefighters to their turnout gear, which also happens to be made waterproof. for good reasons, and that might be the essential part of it, that they don't want to get the firefighter wet when putting out a fire, because then the 60 pounds of gear they're already carrying becomes 100 pounds of gear, and it's much more burdensome to do that and fight actively in a fire. We obtained used and new turnout gear samples, and we examined them all, and there was PFAS in every layer of the gear, and lots of it. Did it come off? Yes, we found, you'll see my students are wearing gloves handling the gear because it came off garment to hand transfer, which is pretty alarming. Does it get into the firefighter? We don't know that for sure, but we've started both a dust exposure where we see it in the dust that you could accidentally ingest or inhale. We also see it, we've started a dermal absorption study, and that will be published soon. The scary part is these are not just firefighters, but all our outdoor wear clothing has the same thing. And so it's just the firefighters on the forefront of what happens. What happened from this publication was that it caught a lot of attention amongst firefighters and not many other people. We published it and said there was a potential exposure risk. There was a lot of fluorine there. It comes off and presents a risk as it presents. And the International Association of Firefighters took that seriously and commissioned their own study, which is due to be published in the next month or so. And that's going to be very exciting. I'm also a co-author on that one. And it turns out to validate everything we showed in the first paper, plus a whole heck of a lot more that I wasn't able to measure. And they've, Jennifer Field's lab has done a wonderful job of exposing a whole different source of these things. And again, it's the replacements that are coming off these things that are in such high concentrations that it does represent a threat to the wearer of these garments. Now, we don't know how big a threat because exposure studies haven't been done. And one of the things I'll note is that in Jennifer's talk, she did a great talk about the C8 study. That took 8 years to conduct. Each of these studies for each chemical takes years to conduct. If we have 4,000 chemicals or even only 1,000 chemicals out there, you can imagine how long it'll take to get all those studies done. We need to be more proactive than that. And the result of this was that there was at the last union meeting of the IAFF, they passed a resolution by 1,536 to 10 to vote the manufacturers of turnout gear off their committee that were allowed into the meetings thereafter. Great advertising revenue for them. They were all kicked out and they refused to take another dime from these companies until they offered PFAS-free alternatives. And remarkably enough, within a week of that resolution, all 4 companies have promised to produce a PFAS-free coat, and one of them actually has. One of the companies was proactive and had a PFAS-free textile beforehand. Still in the process of getting it changed. It'll take 5 years to change, but change can happen quicker than just regulating it. And this is the most recent study that was also alluded to earlier, and it made a big splash as well. And we've discovered how to do this. It's not just our responsibility as scientists to study this, but to educate and to alert people that some things are going on. And we looked at compounds, fluorinated compounds in North American cosmetics. Had it been looked at in Europe a few years earlier, and they found that, yeah, when they said they used PFAS that was in the product. So we looked at a couple of compounds they didn't. We looked at liquid lipsticks and we looked at mascara, both of which were omitted in the earlier study. And they come in waterproof versions. The new liquid lipsticks that are typically worn by the younger generation, and the mascara comes in waterproof versions or long-lasting versions. And we found them to be very highly fluorinated. Typically, 90% of the mascara, the waterproof mascaras were fluorinated, which reeked of intentional use. And it was very highly fluorinated. And when we did the LC mass spec analysis, we identified dozens of different individual PFAS analytes in there. But one of the advantages of my technique is it gets all PFAS, not just the ones that are being regulated. And because of the direct exposure path through tear ducts or inhalation or ingestion, there's a threat to the wearer. But also, most mascara ends up in the landfill. You leave the cap off one night and dries out, you throw it out away. That will wash into the environment and will be eating it, everyone, whether you wear cosmetics or not. And what's remarkable is if you put it in the journal with a free access, this one rocketed to the top of the list of 69,000 downloads in the last 4 months, 3.5 months, which is the #1 for the journal to date, which is kind of interesting. People are very attached to their cosmetics. And if you say that there's a source of something to be concerned about in there, and what this article wasn't aimed at the consumer, it's aimed at the industry, because we don't identify which industry had which chemical, but we do call out the industries that had them. And all of the major cosmetic industries have some products that are fluorinated, and all of them, encouragingly, have some which are not. And so how essential is the use of having waterproof mascara versus regular mascara? And could it be possible that a green chemistry solution could come up with an alternative? And the industry is taking this under advisement very seriously because they have some very angry customers because there's no way to read a label today and tell whether it's fluorinated or not. The labels are dated in their terminology, and they are just not accurate. They say synthetic mica instead of PAPS treated mica, which is a more correct way to say it, which is a fluorochemical. And they don't announce that the fluorochemicals are there. And so you can't even tell as a consumer which ones you're buying has it. And that's where they're going to get into trouble. And they will, several companies have contacted us and said, could you tell us how to do this? And of course, any commercial company will tell you this, but first thing you have to do is clean up your supply chain. So I wanted to end there. I know we're out of time, but I wanted to say that it's not all doom and gloom. There's a lot that everybody can do. PFAS are going to be a really significant environmental problem for literally my lifetime and several lifetimes to come. It's mainly because of its persistence. It doesn't break down under normal situations, and we're going to need new technologies to get rid of it. There are multiple PFAS, multiple sources of PFAS, multiple routes of exposure. And we need, obviously, to study more fate and transport and exposure paths. And we're all clamoring for more funding to do that, but also more time to do that. So in the meanwhile, I claim that there's a real need to raise awareness, to educate people, to discuss policies and practices. The firefighters came up with their own practices to reduce their exposure. And it's just because now they're aware of risk, they know how to minimize it. And it is possible to have examples. There's lots of examples. Both Linda and Jennifer know of them and have used them themselves. But all the PFAS scientists in this country are actively engaged in, well, what alternatives are out there and what can we do? My email is below if you have questions, but we'll also have time, I think, after the break or before the break to have questions here. And with that, I'll conclude.
Great. Thank you, Graham. We actually don't have too much time for questions here right now to keep us on schedule, but I did leave a good chunk of time at the end kind of anticipating this. So hopefully that's no problem. I want to thank you so much for your presentation. I did happen to make note of some Graham quotables that I intend to use later. So like, I've never met a good PFAS. That's pretty funny. So thank you for taking us through that and raising our awareness. Really appreciate that perspective. And it's always good to hear phrases like particle accelerator and all kinds of physics things we never think about. So anyway, appreciate that. I wanted to mention to the group before we take a short break, a number of, if you're into reading books or audio books, there is a pretty extensive book called Exposure by the lawyer who sued DuPont on behalf of PFOA mostly, but that does go through that C8 study, which was fascinating to me. So if you want to catch up on that, there's also a documentary called The Devil We Know, which talks about that study as well. So lots of good ways to keep learning via pop culture or those sorts of things. So thanks to Purdue Center for the Environment, to Notre Dame for bringing science to the discussion. We're going to take a short break and come back, and then we'll take a look at what's going on kind of in the regulatory world, and as well as talk to one of our drinking water providers. So looking really forward to using the science as a background to launch into some policy as well as just some understanding about what we have out there. So we will see you guys back here. According to our agenda, we had about a 10-minute break, but we're going to aim to be back here about 2:45. So take your restroom break, grab another glass of water, and we'll see you in just a little bit. Welcome back, everybody. That was a short, fast break. Hopefully you got what you needed, because we have some great stuff coming for you this next session. I wanted to introduce Anne Tavalier. Is that right, Anne? Do I have the pronunciation right? Great. Joining us from Michigan. And we noticed your claim to fame when Graham showed that map about incidents and sites. So we know that that has a lot to do with how advanced your program there is, more so than the prevalence of Michigan having some special consideration about PFAS. So Anne is with us, as I mentioned, from Michigan. She's the Director of Environmental Stewardship. Oh, I'm sorry, that is not her title. That's the other Anne. How about Anne's title is a Pre-Treatment Program Specialist at the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, which has a cool acronym of, looks kind of like EAGLE. I'm not sure if you say that internally, Anne, or not, but we're really glad to have you here to kind of take us to this next step out of the science and into what's actually happening in our environment, and different strategies that you're using in Michigan to both understand what's going on and potentially prevent or regulate what's happening. So with that, I'll just turn it over to you, and welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. Can you hear me okay? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So here's what I'm going to be talking about. Try to meet the time allowance here. So a lot of information, but I work in the emerging pollutants section within EAGLE, within the Water Resources Division. So I'm going to be talking about wastewater as it pertains to PFAS. So I wanted to let people know about, in Michigan, we have, it's called MPART. It's the Michigan PFAS Action Response Team. And so due to the statewide scope of contamination and the public health threat that had led to the creation of MPART to ensure efficient and effective responses. And so MPART is an advisory body charged with coordinating the actions of key state departments responsible for environmental and natural resources protection, agriculture, public health, military installations, fire departments, and commercial airports. So we also coordinate with local and federal agencies, with stakeholders to ensure that we're being consistent across the state, share information, and leverage our resources. And MPART's really been the main reason we've been so successful at rapidly identifying and reducing exposures, and has enabled a comprehensive, data-driven, and science-based approach. I don't expect you to read all of this, but this is more just for your information of all the different departments that are under the MPART umbrella. So moving on to PFAS criteria in Michigan, which has really been the main driver of why we can do what we do in Michigan, is because we have criteria and we don't have to rely on the federal government. So for the wastewater, we have PFAS criteria in surface water for PFOA and PFAS. And so this table is our surface water quality standards. We are currently working on revising our PFOA criteria, and we are currently assessing the potential for PFHXS and PFNA to build up in fish tissue so that we can potentially derive human health values for these two PFAS next year. And just noting that our surface water quality, our surface water criteria is so low in PFOS due to the bioaccumulative nature of PFAS in fish, which then we eat. And so here's our drinking water criteria, which we established in August of 2020. It limits 7 PFAS chemicals in municipal drinking water. And the new drinking water standards also updated our existing groundwater cleanup criteria for PFAS and PFOA, which at the time we were using the 70 parts per trillion PFAS and PFOA, which is the EPA lifetime health advisory level. So now that we have these drinking water standards, our groundwater cleanup criteria for PFAS became 16 parts per trillion, and PFOA became 8 parts per trillion. So this, I'm going to talk about our industrial pretreatment PFAS initiative, which is kind of my main thing. So I'll talk kind of a lot about that more in depth before moving on to our other wastewater strategies. And so there were a number of potential approaches to addressing pass-through of pollutants to waters of the state from wastewater treatment plants. And we chose to focus on finding sources of PFAS rather than first screening wastewater treatment plant effluent, because we were concerned that we would miss sources due to dilution or the intermittent nature of some discharges. And it's also generally more effective to eliminate and treat at the lower volume concentrated source than at the wastewater treatment plant, which has a higher volume and is more dilute. And so sources are generally discharging from a range of around 5,000 gallons per day, upwards to 400,000 gallons per day, while treatment plants are generally discharging from 500,000 gallons upwards to 50 million gallons a day. So for our initiative, which we launched in February of 2018, we have 95 wastewater treatment plants in Michigan that have an industrial pretreatment program out of our, I think, roughly 300 wastewater treatment plants in Michigan. So they were to look for sources of PFAS within, and they were required to evaluate their industrial users and other sources such as contaminated sites. And they were to conduct follow-up sampling of those probable sources. And then they were to then sample their wastewater treatment plant effluent if they, sampled a metal finisher and they had PFAS above the 12 parts per trillion for PFAS, which is our water quality standard, which we kind of used as a screening criteria to determine source versus not a source. And so all this data was coming in to us in 2018 and 2019. And so this graph shows the distribution of wastewater treatment plants for influent data for PFAS and PFOA. So out of 47 wastewater treatment plants that did sample their influent, 76% had PFOS that was detected, 76% had PFOA, 81% PFOA or PFAS. Apologize, I'm getting over a cold. So this just shows the distribution for effluent. So we obviously had a lot more wastewater treatment plants that were sampling their effluent as part of the initiative. And you can see here that a lot of our IPPs had found PFAS and PFOA in their effluent. And so of the data that we got from the treatment plants, these were the sources that they were finding. And so no surprise was metal finishers are a very significant source of PFOS to the wastewater treatment plant. And so it's important to note that the fume suppressants that contain PFOS that the metal finishers were using were banned in 2015. Excuse me. And none of the platers that we identified were currently using anything with PFOS. So this is just a legacy issue that they're dealing with. Some other sources where sites where AFFF was being used, landfills, paper manufacturing, centralized waste treaters, industrial laundry facilities, and then a medical product facility. And so for those of you familiar with the industrial pretreatment program, you'll be familiar with these EPA federal industry types. So this is just a distribution of the industrial users that are regulated by the federal IPP regs. And so this just shows, excuse me, the distribution of where we found PFOS. So you can see 433 and 413 are the metal finishing or electroplating category, obviously the main source of PFOS to the wastewater treatment plants. So to deal with all the data that we were getting from the initiative, we developed this bin system, excuse me, to classify our wastewater treatment plants. So in 2018, we started out with 95 treatment plants that have IPPs. We're now up to 97. And so again, this just is how we try to sort through all those facilities based on what they found. So the bin 3s were kind of our highest priority. They were finding sources of PFOS to their system, and they were then exceeding our water quality standards at the end of their pipe to surface waters of the state. So those were our high priority facilities that we wanted to take care of. And we even broke up our bin 3 to, if you were above 50 parts per trillion in your effluent, we had you take a sample of your biosolids to see what was going on there. And then if you were below 50, you didn't have to sample for biosolids. This is just another way to show what we found. So overall, 68% of our IPP wastewater treatment plants in Michigan are meeting water quality standards. And this is as of August of 2021. It obviously looked a little different when we first started out. But many of these wastewater treatment plants who have identified sources have had 2+ years to work with those sources to reduce and eliminate. And so this graph, shows some really substantial reductions in PFOS from the wastewater treatment plants. It really speaks to how well our PFAS initiative is working. And these are, again, reductions primarily due to some sort of PFAS treatment being installed at the industrial source. And of the 9 treatment plants listed here, 7 of them is where they had a metal finisher as the primary source of PFAS to the wastewater treatment plant. So it's certainly, we've had a really good working relationship between our sources and our wastewater treatment plants. This is a graph of Lapeer wastewater treatment plant, again, just showing how treating PFAS at the source is the most effective way to reduce PFAS from the wastewater treatment plant. So you can see the PFAS effluent is the yellow line here. And then GAC was installed in 2017. And then it was a modified GAC system in April. So you can see how their effluent has now been able to trend down now at the wastewater treatment plant, now that the source of PFAS has had treatment installed. So here's, again, just a couple other examples of what successful PFAS treatment has looked like at sources. It's usually a combination of GAC and resin to be able to reduce their concentrations. So moving forward, Eagle is phasing in PFAS and PFOA limits into municipal wastewater treatment plant and PDS permits starting October 1st of this year. So monitoring only will likely be required for the first 4 years or so to allow time for municipalities to achieve compliance with permit limits. And treatment plants with pretreatment programs that have PFAS and PFOA limits will generally need to establish a local limit for those pollutants and require compliance if they haven't done so already. So I wanted to talk about our statewide PFAS assessment because that kind of helped drive how we handle biosolids at wastewater treatment plants. And so this was done in November of 2018, where we assessed the occurrence of 24 PFAS at 42 wastewater treatment plants. So we sampled influent, effluent, and biosolids. And so there we selected 3 groups of wastewater treatment plant, kind of various flows, large, medium, and small, and as well as various treatment processes at the plant. And so this graph just shows the percent detection of PFAS in the influent, effluent, and treated solids. And we do have some data from PFOS effluent data from our non-IPP wastewater treatment plants I just wanted to share. So all the PFAS from the non-IPPs were below the water quality standard except for one, and that's likely due to infiltration into the sanitary sewer and contamination from past releases of AFFF. So getting to biosolids, the initial average of PFAS concentration for all of our samples from our statewide study was 184 parts per billion, while the median concentration was 13. And you can see here in this purple, this includes solids from 7 wastewater treatment plants that we determined to be industrially impacted, meaning that their PFOS concentrations were at or above 150 parts per billion. And so if we restricted land application at that time for those facilities. So through the implementation of the PFAS initiative and the treatment plants reducing concentrations at the source, we've seen effective reductions of concentrations in the biosolids that had formerly impacted plants. And so when we remove those 7 wastewater treatment plants, the recalculated average lowers to 18 from 184 parts per billion. So we rolled out this past summer our land application of biosolids containing PFAS. Again, more information is posted at this link here. But it applies to about 160 wastewater treatment plants, requires sampling, reporting, mitigation, and communication to landowners and farmers. Excuse me, I'm going to talk really quickly about our industrial direct and industrial stormwater and groundwater strategies. Here's a lovely infographic. So we have developed a permitting compliance strategy for industrial direct and industrial stormwater permittees that are found to be discharging PFAS above the water quality standard. Here is shown various ways that PFAS may enter lakes and streams from an industry. Facilities found to have discharges with PFAS and PFOA, excuse me, will be asked to enter an administrative consent order that will contain enforceable compliance schedules, sampling requirements, and stipulated penalties for failure to comply. Again, this is obviously there's a lot of industries to look at. We use the data from the IPP PFAS initiative to prioritize particular industries to look at first. And so those were the metal finishers, paper manufacturers, landfills, and that facilities that have AFFF on site, trained with it, or used it. And again, this link here will take you to our compliance strategy for you to read more about. So of the highest priority industrial stormwater facilities, they are being directed to conduct a short-term waste characterization study for all the discharge points or outfalls. They have to evaluate for PFAS and any other pollutants of concern like metals, and it includes wet weather sampling and dry weather sampling if applicable. So like I said, we're going to address these through administrative consent orders rather than their NPDES permits. It's going to include enforceable schedules, source tracking, corrective actions, effluent goals and monitoring. And beyond the ACO, the PFAS could be integrated eventually into their NPDES permits. Sorry, everybody. And so lastly, groundwater. So with the establishment of that Part 201 criteria, we are turning our attention to groundwater discharges. Oh, sorry. So we do have a select municipal wastewater treatment plants that discharge to ground. We're also looking at car wash, vehicle wash water facilities, laundry facilities, and some school districts. And based on our study, we'll develop permitting and compliance strategy, just like we did with industrial stormwater and industrial direct. So I just compiled a list for additional information that you can check out on your own time. And then plugging our detailed report that we released earlier this summer, which is where a lot of those graphs were pulled from. And I'm, again, just one person that deals with pretreatment. These are my counterparts, Tom Berditsky and Carla Davidson, as well as Stephanie Kamer, who is the manager of the emerging pollutant section. Whew, all right, I think I'm done, and I really apologize for the coughing.
That is okay. We're really glad and grateful to have you here, Anne. I know when we talked last week, you weren't feeling great. So I do appreciate you sticking to this commitment and sharing this with us. It's certainly interesting to see, you know, all the kind of different ways of going at this stuff. So really, thank you so much for being here. I just want to really encourage folks to use the chat for questions. So we are doing just fine with our schedule, so we'll have plenty of time for those, but I thought it might be a nice segue to just go ahead and hear from our state environmental agency, or one of the state environmental agencies, the Indiana Department of Environmental Management. So Matt Prater is here to join us to tell us a little bit about some things IDEM has going on in this regard, and to just serve as a resource for us. So we really appreciate that. Matt, thank you for being here, and looking forward to hearing what you have going on and helping us set the stage locally after hearing from one of our neighbors to the north and all the things they have going on. So the screen should be yours, and the floor is yours, Matt.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jill, for asking me to present here today. Really appreciate it. So you can see my slides okay and hear me okay?
Yes, perfect.
All right, good deal. Yeah, a lot of stuff going on in Region 5 states. It's good to see what Michigan's work is doing. And of course, Ohio, I know they've been busy too, in Illinois and Wisconsin. So I'm here to talk to you today about IDEM's PFAS sampling work plan. It was about a year and a half ago, our commissioner came to us and asked us to develop a work plan for sampling of PFAS at all the community water systems throughout the state of Indiana. And we have around 700, almost 800 community water systems throughout the state. So just go over the project purpose of that to determine the potential impact of PFAS compounds affecting the community water systems throughout the state. And we also wanted to determine if the further investigation is needed, if we find any kind of hotspots, any high hits of PFAS in our sampling. And then, of course, we want to provide transparency of our results, post the results on our website. And when they're finalized, all results have been QA, QC, they'll be posted on the website. And then, of course, provide any educational materials and guidance to the systems too. So this slide just kind of goes over the project outline and how we developed it based on population sizes, how we decided on when we would start sampling at the system. So for the phase 1, we are starting out with the medium-sized systems. And that's when I say medium-sized, that's a population between 3,300 and 10,000. And for phase 2, this is actually a majority of our community water systems fall in this category of the small systems serving a population less than 3,300. Now, the reason we started out this way is because all of the large systems in the state actually did sample some type of sampling for PFAS back in UCMR3 sampling, which I believe was in 2014, 2015. So they did have an idea if there were any issues a few years ago. We wanted to hit the systems that have not sampled for PFAS yet. So that's why we began with those size systems. This slide just goes over the timetable and gives you an idea of how many samples we're looking at for this project. So right now, actually, we're almost finished up with phase 1 sampling, and we'll end in October of this year. POE, that column there, it stands for point of entry. So that's sampling after all treatment, and it really is representative of what the customers are consuming. And in this project, we are including raw water sampling points. So that's sampling at the intakes or at the wells, that's before any type of treatment. The commissioner really wanted to get those results too and get a better idea of what's going on throughout our state. So as you can see, there's definitely quite a few samples when you include the finished water sampling and raw water sampling. We're looking at over 3,000 samples to be collected when it's all said and done. The sampling project expected to end in May of 2023 if we stick to that timeline. This is a pretty neat map. It just gives you an idea of all the PFAS sampling locations we're looking at throughout the state, and that's representative of the community water systems. And you can see majority of the systems are in the central northern part of the state here. Just going on to some more details of the sampling project. So the samples will be collected by the drinking water system certified operators or an individual who has an experience collecting compliance samples, what we ask. This was a similar method done in the UCMR3 sampling event. We partnered with the IDOH laboratory. They're the designated lab to ship out all the sample bottles. They'll be receiving the sample bottles and doing the analysis and finalizing their reports and sending those reports to IDEM. Of course, we're sending out the sampling guidance material to the operators ahead of time so they have a really good understanding of how to collect the samples and how to minimize cross-contamination and make sure that a representative water sample is collected. And we are also going to be shipping out field blanks and again, just to note if there's any kind of cross-contamination issues, that will help with the QA/QC process. So for the lab method that we are running, it's the EPA method 537.1, and this was recommended by EPA, and it goes through these 18 different PFAS listed on this slide. And I just wanted to show you the action levels that we're using. This is similar to what Ohio used when they did their sampling with the community water systems. And just to give you an idea of what levels we're looking at to compare the results to. So just to go over how we are going through the response reporting, getting these results in. So we have response protocols if there's any kind of action levels exceeded, including a recommendation for public notification and issuance of any drinking water advisories that may be necessary. If any results are greater than or equal to 50% of the EPA health advisory level, we plan on collecting confirmation samples at the entry point or raw water sampling points just to verify those results. Since we all know this, it's very easily to contaminate some of these cross-contamination of some of these samples. And of course, we'll be reviewing all the sample results that come in. We want to notify the system within 2 weeks from the date we receive the results from the lab. And then all sample results, when it's finalized, QA/QC'd, will be posted on our website and available to the public. This just gives you an idea of the costs that we're looking at. We are using EPA grant funding for this sampling project. And fortunately partnering with IDOH, we were able to make this really a cost-effective project. And I think the average sample cost we're looking at is about $90 a sample. And just a couple links here that IDEM has on our website. And if you want more information on our sampling project, we have an information sheet, about a 2-pager, and just kind of summarizes what I talked about here today. And then we also have some other detailed information about some of the EPA activities too with PFAS on our website. And I do want to touch on just some quick updates from EPA and what we've been hearing from them in regards to PFAS and drinking water. So they did recently say that there will be 29 different types of PFAS will be in the UCMR5 sampling event. And monitoring for UCMR5 is expected to begin in 2023. And that's for all community water systems with a population greater than 3,300. And then we've also heard that EPA will most likely release a maximum contaminant level goal for PFOA and PFOS by the end of 2021. Again, that's for drinking water MCLG. And if you have any questions about this project, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or any of our staff here at IDEM. We can definitely help answer any questions about this project. And that's all I have, Jill.
Okay, thanks so much, Matt, for catching us up on where things are. I have lots of questions about how states have come to be where they are, but I guess we will hold those for our question time. I wanted to introduce, I mistakenly almost introduced Ann McKeever before, but Ann McKeever is joining us from Citizens Energy Group or Citizens Water. They are Indianapolis's drinking water provider, as well as provide supply to some areas around here as well, communities around here. Ann is the Director of Environmental Stewardship at Citizens. And so Ann is not going to be sharing any slides with us. So Matt, you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen and we'll just return to the little checkerboard of faces and we'll welcome Ann. And Ann is going to share some experiences or knowledge they have there at Citizens. Ann, thanks for being here.
Yeah, Jill, thanks for inviting Citizens to say a few words this afternoon during the forum. I can't really speak for all of Central Indiana, just about our limited experiences with UCMR3 that Dr. Lee mentioned in her presentation. So we sampled for the 6 PFAS compounds that Dr. Lee mentioned in our finished water back in 2015. We collected 26 samples total over the course of UCMR3. There were 16 samples, so four samples from each of our 4 surface water plants. And then for our 5 groundwater plants at the time, each of those plants were sampled twice. So again, for the 26 samples that we collected, they were non-detect for the PFAS compounds at the time. And because at that time, there was no indication that we had PFAS impacting our waters, we haven't done any additional testing since 2015. So you just heard from Matt about the PFAS sampling project for drinking water. And so we have received the letter from IDEM letting us know that the sample kit for our Morgan system is on its way. So as soon as we get that sample kit, we'll be collecting the point of entry and the source water samples for the Morgan system, which is a purchased water system in the northern part of Morgan County. And then we anticipate receiving sample kits from the agency for the other 4 systems that we have, our South Madison system, the Westfield system, and then ultimately the Indianapolis system as IDEM moves into their large public water systems. So I was going to talk about UCMR5, but Matt did a fabulous job on that. So I could not top what Matt did on UCMR5. So that's really where we are right now. Monitoring what IDEM is doing and taking our lead from them.
Okay, great. Thanks for that update, Ann. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
It's always good to have some industry experience and understand what you guys are up to there. So with that, I want to kind of open this up for some discussion and conversation. As I mentioned, we had a number of legislators that are interested or have in the past brought various versions of legislation forward. I also would like to acknowledge that we did hear from some other folks, including Graham, who said that there are quicker options than legislation to see some improvement. So a lot of different ways to go at working on this problem together across all different kinds of user groups and consumers. So like you to encourage you to ask some questions in chat. We'll get those answered. I'd like to encourage all the speakers that are still with us to please turn their videos back on so that you guys are available for folks. We did have a couple of questions in the chat, and one of them, even though I made myself a note, I delinquently forgot to give a special thank you to our colleagues and friends at Hoosier Environmental Council who have hosted a forum similar to this in terms of the science for our legislators in the past and work diligently to protect our environment. So thank you, Hoosier Environmental Council. Thank you, speakers, for putting your videos back on. It's great. So I mentioned Hoosier Environmental Council because it looks like Indra asked a question about what does UCMR stand for? So that maybe is either for Matt or Ann. And then I do believe Indra had an earlier question for Ann Tavaler from Michigan.
Yeah,
so who can take the UCMR?
UCMR stands, I should have said that, unregulated contaminant monitoring rule. So EPA every few years, they come out with 30 contaminants that are unregulated, but they wanted systems to take a look to see if there's any issues with that. And then from that, they could ultimately establish a rule or an MCL for those contaminants.
Great.
Someone else
Thanks,
may be able to
Matt.
explain it better, but that's how I know it.
Sounds good. I think I followed that. We can't regulate what we don't have that isn't regulated. So, okay. And Indra, you had another question before about asking Anne, why were schools included in the groundwater study, or how do schools fit in here?
Yeah, so we're including them because we had heard from another state that they were able to trace back a significant source of PFAS to a school. And we also had, in Michigan, sampled all of our public drinking water supplies back in 2019. We did have a few schools that had PFAS detections in their wells with no known source nearby. So trying to figure that out, as well as just, again, we've kind of got a lot of data on surface water and where sources are contributing to where we're seeing it in surface water, but it's just now focusing our attention on the groundwater now that we have criteria that we can enforce. So just part of the overall package of facilities out there.
Great, thanks. I have another question here for Matt. If you can speak to the funding that might be available in Indiana. We have some new water infrastructure money floating around. People have heard a lot about it at the Water Summit, as well as through other avenues. Is any of that eligible or available to help us get a better handle on this issue in our state?
What I've heard is there should be emerging contaminant grant funding that will become available through the bill, but we really don't hear about anything solid until we hear from EPA directly at Region 5 saying, okay, Indiana has allocated this amount of money. So that's as much as I know for that.
Okay. Yeah, I saw the emerging contaminants on the list of things too. We have kind of related to that. The next question up is one of the main arguments that has been heard about setting PFAS MCL or declaring it a hazardous substance is that it would affect the production of medical supplies. How valid is that argument overall for Indiana? Anybody want to weigh in? Maybe one of our folks that knows how those things evolve inside of those different supply chains. Is that a valid argument? Wondering if Graham was still around, if that was one of those things he could assess with his detector. Okay, Kelly's telling me that he's off, but he may come back, so we might table that question. Jennifer or Linda, do you have any sense of that? No, okay. Great, we'll move on. Let's see, the subject is rather new to some of us in the legislature. It looks like Representative Aylesworth is on. Thank you for being here, even though I know you guys have districting voting and discussions happening. Can anyone provide examples of legislation passed in other states that would be helpful? I wondered that myself, Mike, when, where did all of Anne's stuff start from and how did that happen? And was there a lot of controversy around that?
Yeah, so our surface water criteria dates back to 2011. And that was, we have, as part of our surface water assessment section, who goes out and samples various watersheds on a basin schedule, we had been sampling for PFAS back then and, didn't really see anything of note. And then when Wolverine happens over on the west side of the state, and with the tannery there, that had, led us to go back again and start looking at our PFAS concentrations in surface water and work to develop criteria for that. The reason why we can do the things we can do is because we have surface water criteria, we now have drinking water criteria, and we have groundwater criteria, which can move, which is why we have so many contamination sites in Michigan. But that can move the needle on industry to do something. We can force people to do things now. We have a lot of DoD sites that we're working with. Yeah, it really is just our governor decided that we wanted to enact drinking water legislation and not wait for EPA. And there was, I think with everything with Wolverine going on, and then Parchment happened, there was definitely the political will to move forward on that.
Did you see pushback from the industrial community or the drinking water operators?
I wasn't super involved in all those conversations, but at least on the wastewater side, we've had a really great working relationship between the wastewater treatment plants and our industry. No one wants to be seen as not doing something. So I think the public really galvanized the issue where it couldn't be ignored, which has worked to our advantage to get industry to install very expensive GAC treatment in the matter of months, as opposed to 5 years. So we have metal finishers that are spending millions of dollars on GAC installation in a matter of months. But the public outcry was there.
Hey, I see a comment more than a question from Martha about that some states have banned certain uses of PFAS. Martha, did you want to share an example of that, or other panelists maybe understand that a little bit better? Are there ways in which the approved uses can help govern this conversation?
That's just more of a comment in response to Mr. Aylesworth's request. I mean, that's certainly a legislative type of activity, not an agency type of activity. I just have heard tell, and you can do some Googling to find, like, for example, surprisingly, Vermont banned it in the use of ski wax. Didn't know that ski wax was containing PFAS, and Vermont's a big skiing state, so there has been some bold moves out there that I'm not sure everyone was aware of, so I thought I'd add that comment.
Great, thank you, Martha. And Representative Aylesworth is acknowledging that, yeah, many of our representatives are in transit after redistricting a conversation, so we will definitely catch up with them later. Another question about how much more difficult would water treatment become for a small public system if PFAS regulations were adopted? Would this be a huge leap for them to accomplish? I think that's Enrique, that's a good question. It was in my mind too. We were having conversations on the break here about the expense and who pays for that. And, do we start to get into equity concerns and cost of water and water treatment, which has already seen a big jump due to our long-term control plan kind of work. So thank you for asking that. Anybody want to weigh in on that piece in terms of how big of a lift it would be for some of the smaller treatment plants? Or maybe, Anne, you have some experience with the size of those plants and their ability to handle this?
Not looking, Jill, at PFAS treatment. That's why I was kind of pointing at Matt, because on my screen, Matt is right there.
Yeah, it definitely would not be an easy task by any means for a small community system to have to install treatment. I think Anne kind of touched on this with the granular activated carbon treatment is the go-to mostly to address these. It is costly for maintenance and the initial install. Fortunately, we've heard that there's some SRF funding that will be available if there's any issues that do pop up in our sampling project, that we will be able to work with the Indiana Finance Authority to help those systems out and finance the treatment if needed.
And Tavalier, would you like to comment on any experiences you've had up there with the scale of the treatment plants and their ability to respond?
can't really speak to drinking water. Not my division. Again, for the wastewater treatment plants, we do have the strategy that says you may get effluent limits in your NPDES permit come October 1st if you are exceeding our water quality standards. But again, it gives, there's going to be compliance schedules included and time to complete that. But again, our message has been controlling it at the source rather than, putting treatment, carbon treatment within a wastewater treatment plant. We do have one Kalamazoo wastewater treatment plant does use activated carbon. I think it was for PCB removal. And so that has shown some effectiveness in terms of further treatments, because they do have a number of sources there. But again, it was an extreme cost to them to increase how much activated carbon that they were going to use. And so again, we really want the industry to be responsible in cleaning, switching out tanks, lining sewers, product substitution, or installing treatment, rather than putting it onto the municipal wastewater treatment plant, which could then potentially trickle down to consumers.
Right. We were having the conversation in the office here about much like pharmaceuticals, the question of, does it come out at the drinking water plant? Does it come out at the wastewater plant? And it kind of prompted some of us to think about what the effluent does in the stream. So I was going to just jump back over to Jennifer and see if, Jennifer, are you or your colleagues or others working on wildlife impacts in terms of toxicity? So even if we attack it at the drinking water side and ensure human exposure is reduced, what happens to all the effluent coming into the streams in terms of ecology impacts? Any information there?
Yeah, so my specific lab, we're really interested in just adverse health outcomes in humans, but we have a large PFAS research group here at Purdue, and a few of those researchers are specifically addressing questions related to wildlife. So that is being assessed, and we know that in many of those circumstances, those organisms are going to be in closer contact, of course, with any of these contaminants, increasing their, the body burden of how much of these contaminants that they're going to have on them. And so there definitely are ongoing studies trying to identify and get a better understanding of the toxicity that you're going to see in the various types of wildlife.
Okay, thanks. Another question about if we know what the top PFAS sources are here in Indiana. Wondering if maybe Linda or Jennifer, one of you guys that have been looking at our state in particular, know that. And then, Anne, if you wouldn't mind, you weighed in a little bit in terms of the manufacturing impacts there, but what you're seeing as well would be helpful. But Linda or Jennifer, any thoughts on what we know about the top PFAS sources here in the state?
So I don't know if Linda's back on again. I know she had to run out to her class really quickly, but I would table that question for her when she comes back, because she has a lot of information on that.
And Graham is back, Kelly's telling me, which is great. So maybe we can jump back up to the unanswered question we had earlier. Graham, are you available to turn your video on for us?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I also had a class emergency. I had to jump out for a second, but I'm back.
Well, yes, I can't believe we've corralled this many smart people on this topic at the same time. Anyhow, we had a question earlier about whether or not medical supplies, what's the relationship there? And, people were kind of asking, like, is that a legitimate argument for, maintaining that in medical supplies, and that's what's going on here? Have you used your technology to test on some of those things?
Yeah, we've looked at all sorts of things like sampling equipment, medical supplies. There is the definition of essential use. And we do know of a surgery that's used a certain type of fluorodecalin, which is a PFAS. It doesn't use much. It's a retinal reattachment surgery. I would define that as an essential use, but we use perhaps a 55-gallon drum a year for those types of surgeries. not the tanker truck a day that is being pumped out that we currently use for cosmetics and textiles and things like that. So yeah, you could imagine essential use. If you're going to send a spaceship to Pluto, you're going to need fluoro lubricant because that's the only thing that works in space. But again, they were talking about minuscule amounts compared to what we're using now to treat food packaging. And I will weigh in on the most common things, not necessarily in Indiana, but in general. And then Linda can give us specifics, I'm sure. But in general, we're getting it mostly from what we drink and what we eat. So our exposure is coming from drinking water, and drinking water is being impacted most heavily in this country by AFFF and ARAFFF, which are coming from any sort of Air Force base or military base, or often municipal fire departments too, unfortunately, because they were told it was perfectly safe for 60 years, and so some of them practiced. And that'll be where you see a lot of groundwater contamination. You will also see, as Linda mentioned, the applied biosolids, because anything that has high PFAS that gets reused will come out in biosolids in that area. So that's a fear. And that, of course, can get into food. And in the food chain, amongst the plants that take it up, you don't know where they are, but amongst animals, fish are known to be very high bioaccumulators of PFAS, as Jennifer described. So we're doing a Great Lakes study on fish. We just surveyed 700 fish, I think, and we're going to put that into a paper because we can see total fluorine and then dig down on which PFAS are there. And yeah, sports fish are bigger, and that's what people eat, and those have higher PFAS levels. And so that's obviously, in other countries, that's a very high source. So that's what I know about common sources, what you eat and what you drink. There could be inhalation, there could be consumer products and things like that. And certainly those occupationally exposed to consumer products might have more. If you're wearing a waterproof uniform that you're required to wear, that could be bad, but we don't know the extent. And so we can't say that's a major source. It's just an unknown source.
I just want to comment on terms of what we're wearing. Dermal exposure transfer is pretty low. So that's not really where you should get all your worries.
Yeah, we've got some data that suggests maybe it isn't so low. It goes through the skin, but we don't know the extent yet. So it's important. I think we should take care of what we eat and drink first, which is
exactly.
Yeah.
Linda, I'm glad you're back. The question was the most common sources in Indiana of PFAS. Do you have an input on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't have military sites that are significant sources. We do have a couple where there's been some water issues, but not that have migrated off-site. And yes, we have airports, so they're definitely going to be some contribution. And now the airports don't, train with the foams like they used to, and the fire departments, by the way, also produce fire training. I've been to some of the fire training things before it was suggested that they don't do them anymore, and there's definitely a lot of foam flying around. So I mean, I think it's manufacturing. I think it's paper mill companies. So I think a lot of the normal manufacturing processes, we have a lot of manufacturing in the States. So if there's sources, it's going to be that. We also have landfill leachate. It's going to be that. We have there's other places where waste have been stored and we're not, some of them came from factories where PFASs were used. So whether they're, contributing to any glitches. And then of course, people are concerned about biosolids, land application of biosolids. And I think, my general feeling and hope is that most biosolids that are just primarily domestically impacted and not so much directly industrial impacted will not cause significant blips in the groundwater or surface water compared to, other sources. So it would not be just like what Graham said with the clothing. Yeah, so there could be dermal transfer, but that's a lower thing on the priority level to be trying to address. And then back to Michigan's strategy, everything they get rid of coming in isn't going to end up in anything. So it's back to that source treatment. So kind of a long answer. We're still figuring it out. There's a lot of research projects going on in Indiana right now. So I had thought our Indiana rep was going to present a little data, but I guess he wasn't ready to do that.
We do have two streams closed to fishing because of PFAS. Was that mentioned earlier?
No, that was the earliest work that was done out of item was the the one, and I was working with them looking at fish. And so there was just a couple, that had higher than desired levels. They weren't as outrageous as some of the things that Michigan has had to deal with, or even Minnesota. But so Matt, you didn't share any Indiana data. I was hoping you might.
No, we've gotten the preliminary results from IDOH laboratory. We're really waiting on them to finalize the QA/QC process before we want to post it on our website, make sure everything checks off correctly. I can say the preliminary results that we received so far are looking good. No detections for the most part. The detection we did see very, very small detect, not even close to the health advisory level. So.
As long as we're in the item conversation here, Matt, I was wondering, as I was listening to these folks talk about biosolids in application, what kind of crossover is happening? You know, you're the branch chief for the drinking water branch. How does this intersect with the Office of Land Quality or whoever's monitoring some of the land application pieces? Is there work going on to see what's going on like out there in the terrestrial world?
Yeah, I really can't speak too much of that. I mean, we're such in the beginning stages of this. But yeah, I know Office of Land, they're putting a game plan together possibly of looking at some of those cross areas where we can work together. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been working with that office a little bit because we have a couple projects that are going to be looking at PFAS and other compounds of concern, 2 different national priority projects. And I am looking at, I've already analyzed a lot of biosolids in some of the land application sites. We have another project looking at PFAS coming into the wetlands on a gradient of, no biosolids around, industry around versus biosolids. So I really think in the next 1 to 3 years, we're going to have a lot of data, and that's going to supplement what ITEM is doing and give them direction also.
Right. Yeah, once when we start getting more of our raw water sampling data in, that's where we can share that with our Office of Land folks, and they can decide if it's necessary to begin any kind of investigation.
And are you doing that in Michigan, crossover between the departments that way? Can you speak to that at all? Or?
As it pertains to biosolids or?
Yeah, and land application.
Yeah, so we put out our interim strategy for biosolids earlier this summer. So anybody that wants to land apply biosolids, they have to sample for PFOS and provide that information to the landowner and or farmer. They're different people. And there's different kind of bins depending on your concentration. So if you're below 20 parts per billion for PFAS, you're A-okay, you can proceed as normal. But if you're above 20, and depending on where you are above 20 and at 100, like if you're over 150, you can't land apply. Luckily, we haven't found anybody outside of the original 7 that we identified, but we have had a couple people between 20 and 50. And so there's some certain mitigation that they have to do some source tracking. And we actually have in the Thumb area of Michigan, I'm leading an investigation that deals with historical land application from a wastewater treatment plant that received processed wastewater from a paper mill who admitted to using 3M C8 chemistry that then they would subsequently dump down the drain in the 80s to the wastewater treatment plant. And those biosolids have been then land applied all throughout a large county. And we are seeing extremely high elevated surface water concentrations downstream of some of these historical land applications. And again, these were done in the 80s. And we're still seeing very high surface water concentrations from that. And so we've sampled one farm field and saw very high is relative because we don't have soil criteria. So I would just say elevated concentrations. And we are looking to do additional field sampling, fall or winter, once the crops are cleared, to do some additional sampling where we know there were historical land applications on farm fields.
Interesting stuff. I have another question that's kind of spinning around my mind is, you guys, Graham, you were talking about all the wrappers and things going to landfills and leachate and all of those things. Our largest city here in Indianapolis incinerates a lot of its trash. Can any of you researchers talk to us about what the fate of this stuff is when it heads in that direction?
I can take a track at general incineration. If it's a modern incinerator that has high temperatures, then the PFAS will be completely destroyed to inorganic fluoride, HF. And that, while it sounds scary, is actually a safe place to put it in. If you rain fluoride, it's not a known danger to anything. So the worry is that not all incinerators are run to the state that they're to the level the military does to burn Nerf gas. If they're a low temperature or an old or inefficient or just starting up, then some of the PFAS will come out the smokestack unaffected. But if you're at high temperature, and the modern ones are up at 1100, 1200 degrees, that will incinerate all the known PFAS and come out as HF, inorganic fluoride.
It's great. Somebody is reading my mind apparently as well. I have a question in the chat about how do we dispose of objects containing PFAS? Is there any particular precaution as a consumer? I guess I'm also curious about how I would know I had that, but any guidance in that direction about management of the materials that we dispose of?
Michigan has an interesting program. Wisconsin has a different one. The AFFF is the biggest concern, right? There's 125,000 gallons of AFFF in Wisconsin alone at the municipal fire departments, and they're having a buyback program, slow, but they're buying it back and they're setting it out as hazardous waste for incineration. Michigan is doing the opposite. They are also another state collecting their AFFF, but they're putting it in a hazardous waste landfill, a lined landfill, which is, as I understand it, Anne can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's where it's going.
I think in Idaho, it's not
Oh,
staying in Michigan.
Oh, very good. Yeah, it's called the tax, yes, environmental tax for being in a state willing to take hazardous waste.
Yeah, I think it was collected by one of our centralized waste treaters. And I think it's being solidified at a place in Idaho. I don't know if it was being deep well injected or whatnot, but I posted the link to our MPART page where it does talk about our buyback program and how we did our collection.
And it's a very smart program to buy it back, because otherwise these things are just sitting in unlocked cabinets in fire stations for the rest of their lives.
Some of them didn't even realize that what they had. I
found a 5-gallon bucket being used as a doorstop when I gave the lecture at a fire station, and I said, "Oh, look, very nice, a prop," and they embarrassedly put it away. But it's there's a, I think IDEM Emergency Management, FEMA has a repository of 450 gallons sitting downtown here in case something goes on fire and the local fire departments need help. But it is all Class A or Class B foam, which is PFAS driven, and nobody's told them to get rid of it yet. And so I think that's clearly on the list of targets we should look for.
Okay, I'm not seeing too many questions in chat, so I just encourage if you have any last questions to put them there. I have one just based on the work that we do, both with the Water Summit and here with our Regional Alliance, trying to help encourage an educated public and any individual action that might be possible on this topic. It's been fun to listen to all the kind of different angles to come at reduction in sources or regulation, but can you give us, anybody on the call, give us any guidance for the individual citizen or consumer about how we know, Graham, you mentioned when you have the buying power of a fire department to reject a line of clothing, that's one thing, but what do you do at a more individual level to understand if you're supporting the production of these products, or are there any other ways we can engage at that level?
Yeah, I get asked that quite a lot, actually. I mean, what do I do differently? What have I done since I've started this research? And I actually got rid of my consumption of products that I can identify as PFAS. I got rid of my Teflon cookware, not because it leaches off, the Teflon's pretty well bound, but because the production of it involves a lot of PFAS use and release. And I thought my eggs would never be the same. And it turns out my eggs weren't that good to begin with, and they are no worse. In fact, the ceramic works just fine. So there are individual choices you can make. If you can read clothing labels, you can look for the mysterious words of water resistance and DuPont's nano wicking technology. Probably a good thing to avoid. It's never called PFAS, but they'll say it's something, it's modern nanotechnology. They don't know what the heck they're talking about, but they will put labels on there. And you can do some clever clothes shopping. You can do some reasonable shopping of housewares. Carpets are now going, you can ask directly if it's PFAS free, and the newer carpets are. But then there are things like cosmetics where you can read the label, there's nothing on there. So then you do some activism and you say, look, I'll buy a brand that can put a label on it that says no PFAS intentionally added. 4 words that they could put on the label. If they've screened for it, the individual businesses have to screen for it themselves and say, I put it in my requirement, the supply chain doesn't use PFAS. And if I check it once or twice to make sure they're not, then that's probably PFAS free. And that would be very nice to see on all products. You can see it now on the ceramic cookware. It says it's PFAS free. Sometimes PFOA is free and things like that, which is, you gotta be careful with that. There are different standards that are PFOA free versus PFAS free. And it's again, an alphabet soup that Linda talked about. But if it really says PFAS free, that's a modern statement. It probably has been tested by somebody once. And that's better than buying blindly. So as an individual consumer, you should do that. Education about it. We should be clamoring to get PFAS free popcorn, microwave popcorn. But in the meanwhile, you can switch to good old fashioned popcorn. It's healthier than French fries and it's got no PFAS if you cook it in butter and oil. But it will, the microwave one, that's why we're worried. That's from consumer products. As industries, they've got to look more at their supplies and what they use and how essential is what they use.
Anyone else care to weigh in on that sort of individualized guidance that we can take home from this discussion?
Well, you can just, you can write to your legislators and ask them, like we've been telling the legislators here in Indiana legislators to put out incentives. They put out incentives all the time to bring industry to Indiana. So now the ones that are here, give them incentives to switch to alternatives before it's a mandate, since the mandate's not going to come anytime soon. So kind of another door, like what Graham's pushing to try to say, oh, well, we don't want that. We're going to buy from someone else, So, and then there's a lot of furniture companies now that have designated a date when they're going to make sure they're PFAS free. It just takes time because of everything you've heard. There's so many sources and so many pieces that go together in furniture and on and on. So we're making progress, really.
That's great. I hope you feel like this was worth your time joining us today, because you're certainly inspiring the water community today. And lots of people have asked to share this afterwards. I wanted to just acknowledge that there are some great links being put in the chat. I'd like to thank Lynn for adding some of those in there, as well as, maybe Kevin is a colleague of Ann's, I'm not sure, but lots of good links happening in the chat for you. I'm just trying to see if I missed any. Oh, it looks like there's another last question here, maybe from Michelle. As regulations are developed and processed and put in place, how are we ensuring environmental justice issues are considered in terms of the thresholds that are set and/or cleanup prioritization? That's a fantastic question. We know a lot of these things disproportionately impact some areas than others. Any thoughts on the role of environmental justice in this conversation before we work toward our conclusion here? That's a big topic. And has that been part of Michigan's strategy at all? Or, Graham, were you going to weigh in?
I'll let Ann go first if she'd like. It's much more important.
Right. We host a lot of public meetings. So we typically, before an MPART site is created, which means you have groundwater above our criteria, we'll host a webinar with the local unit of government. And then we typically do a public town hall that would, potentially cover a handful of sites to let people know that, hey, we're, this is what's going on. They're being listed online. And, this is the remediation or corrective actions that are going to be happening. And people can subscribe to the MPART newsletter that gives information of when our next town halls will be. They've all been virtual. as a result of COVID, but it also allows for greater participation. And I mean, we probably have a public meeting every week in various parts of Michigan to continue our transparency, and we're working on putting all of our data online as well so that the public has access to our fish data, our surface water data. All the drinking water data is already there, but it's certainly an issue that the governor and MPAR prioritize on how we communicate with the public and are sensitive to those communities.
I'll just add, if you're going to think about where environmental justice would exist in any state, not just Indiana, but any state, it's the food supply. How secure is your food supply and where you're getting it from? If you are living off freely available fish for the cost of a fishing lure and maybe a license, you can eat that. That's often a lower, often disadvantages a group that is living off fish and wild game, for example. And then if you think about water, water's free for everyone in the state. Well, what about well water? We're testing all the utilities, and Michigan's done a great job doing that. They're the first state to complete the utility suite. And Indiana's in the process of it apparently. But there's 3 million residents in Michigan, or 3 million residents that drink well water, and that's inaccessible at the cost of the current cost of testing. So I'm sure Michigan's got plans, but it's one of those things that that could be a disadvantaged rural population in Indiana too. And then, of course, a lot of people live near industrial sites. That's not usually the high-priced housing, right? And so that's where you get a third sort of environmental justice aspect. I don't think Indiana is necessarily worse than any other state with that, but I just mentioned those as sort of the vectors you'd look for.
Yeah, I'll just add that as part of our investigation, there's always a residential well component. So we look to see where the surface, where the elevated surface water results are. And then we look at is there anybody on residential wells? They get sampled by us, because as the investigation that I talked about in the thumb area regarding the biosolids will be out next week sampling residential wells, because that's an area that is not served by municipal water. So that is one of the main first questions that gets asked is, okay, where are these people getting their drinking water from?
Yeah, and that one of my projects is looking at rural water in Indiana. We've already started sampling. So.
Yeah, I think the question was to whether or not it gets prioritized as a cleanup, but it certainly sounds like your eyes are on those topics as well. So thanks for that. I'm not seeing any other questions in the chat. I am seeing a number of links though put in there by our partners. So I think, and we're closing in here at 4 o'clock. I want to thank deeply all of our speakers who are showing us the strength we have in Indiana through our research community to continue to understand and address this, and our agency partners and our utility partners and our neighboring states. Going to need all of you as we continue to host conversations and work these various strategies to try to keep everyone safer. So just want to thank you on behalf of the White River Alliance, our primary funding partner, the Nina Mason Pulliam Charitable Trust, the Purdue Center for the Environment, and Hoosier Environmental Council, who all helped put together this speaker panel and advertise this event. So just a great big thank you to you. And then lastly, just to our participants, we are going to post this link to this recording online. So if you have friends or colleagues that are interested, please feel free to share that. We'll follow up with you by email. Thank you for being here and educating yourself or continuing to grow in your knowledge of this topic and your leadership. Really, really appreciate having a strong water community show up like this for this kind of an event. So thank you to all of your participants, and it's 4 o'clock, and I wish you all the best, and we'll look forward to seeing you at our next topical forum, which is about wetlands and where we are on that topic. So that is coming up on October 5th at 3 o'clock. So if you found your way to this one, you can find your way to that one. Please register for that. We'll see you on October 5th to talk about another really important water topic, wetlands. Thank you guys. Have a great afternoon.